I give a shout out in the new edition of Trauma and the 12 Steps to a couple great organizations that really are geared for working with atheists and agnostics in AA. Because there, with a lot of good reason, those organizations have formed because a lot of mainstream 12-step have done a horrible job about making atheists and agnostics feel unwelcome. And even the chapter to agnostics in the AA Big Book is traditionally seen as just very placating and insulting to agnostic folks. And I had the opportunity a couple of years back to read a collection of stories from people in AA who identify as atheist and agnostic. I had a contact who had a story in it, which is how I got acquainted with the book. And I was very impressed, even as somebody who does have a faith in God and a big spiritual practice, that what these stories show me is that there are other things other than God that people can rely on and people can use to really kind of fuel their recovery from within. And I think we have a lot to learn from people who believe differently than us. And a big anthem that I tend to put forward in my work is be open to learn from others, because you may get new insight that helps with your recovery program.
Yeah, absolutely. There's so many lessons in right, recognizing that our way is not the only way. It might be the way for us, but yeah, everybody's different. And so like for people watching right now who obviously have come here because they have PTSD or some, past trauma, do you recommend any specific type of 12-step program? There's a ton of, I know, online things right now, especially given what's going on right now,
Right.
but like any like subset, or like, can you share a little bit about the different varieties they could look into?
Sure. Well, just a little brief history lesson. That 12-step programming traces to the founding of Alcoholics Anonymous, which had its infancy in 1935, but wasn't officially named until 1939. And then from AA, Al-Anon, or the family group, split off of, or spawned from that. And then there was Narcotics Anonymous. And now there's hundreds of fellowships that uses the anonymous thing. I mean, you have Sex Workers Anonymous, Overeaters Anonymous, and then there's, I believe, Food Addicts Anonymous, which still uses the 12 steps, but their approach is a lot different than Overeaters Anonymous. And even with the sex fellowships, you have Sex Addicts Anonymous, Sex and Love Addicts Anonymous, Sexaholics Anonymous, which is a little too rigid for my liking. So I think the key is if you identify that part of your traumatic reaction is this tendency to numb into whatever addictive, whether you like that word or not. So maybe let's just stick with, if you have this tendency to numb in any one of these behaviors that I mentioned, and even for those of us who identify as adult children or might qualify for Al-Anon, there's Codependence Anonymous. A lot of times that numbing is the experience of just being so other focused and other obsessed, and like when they change, when they address. So I think a first point of this is to do a little soul searching and evaluating on how am I numbing to deal with the impact of maybe what happened to me as a result of traumatic experience. And then it would be worthwhile to just do a little search, I would say right now, on, is there a program for this? And as I mentioned, there's a lot to choose from. So I would not necessarily recommend any one 12-step program in terms of as a fellowship for individuals who have been traumatized or recovering from PTSD. The key is to notice where you get the good fit. Another 12-step fellowship is called Emotions Anonymous. That several clients and people I've worked with over the years have found, where if you're not identifying one particular, what we might traditionally call addiction, that Emotions Anonymous might be a helpful platform for you to use some of the 12-step principles to wade through what you're wading through. There's also some dual recovery fellowships for individuals who have both a mental health disorder that may be significant to the point where you need medication, because a lot of their approaches really look at how can we stay responsible with our medicine while also working a path of recovery. And there's just a lot of different paths that are out there. And so the key is look around, and the internet makes that easier. nowadays for sure if you have the internet access, as opposed to having to call. But even phone meetings are still a thing right now, as many of our meetings have moved to Zoom and online platforms like In the Rooms. For many years, some of these lesser known fellowships, like for a while I did Workaholics Anonymous meetings by phone. So work is another one. Work can be a tricky one that we traditionally don't see, because having a hard work ethic can be celebrated as something that's positive.
Right.
But if it's used to numb and to escape, it could certainly fall into this category of what we might consider addiction. Then I think the key is, once you find a fellowship that may feel like it's a good fit, if you are in recovery from a trauma issue, please don't feel that the first meeting you attend is the be all and end all. That one of the great problems of 12-step recovery is that not all meetings are created equally out there in the community, or the ones that you can access online. There are some meetings I would not send any client to, because I think the ethic of the meeting is run in such a dogmatic, rigid, not trauma-informed way. So what I usually encourage folks to do is, once you find a recovery fellowship that may feel like a good fit, or you find some literature, because you may not be able to access a meeting, but reading, let's say, the Overeaters Anonymous text or the Workaholics Anonymous text and working through it can be a good alternative. But if you do decide to start going to meetings, maybe keep a list, a journal entry of how each meeting made you feel. And the key here is not that every meeting is going to make you feel warm and fluffy, because part of recovery is being challenged.
Yeah.
But if you notice that, like, hey, this guy shook my hand in a way that was just really creepy, and nobody seemed to say anything, because stuff like that will happen at meetings. And I'm definitely not, I condemn it. I'm not a fan of it. I think when stuff like that happens, it gives 12 steps a bad name, but it happens. And so the key is to keep a note of, maybe this is a meeting I might want to avoid, or this is a person I might want to avoid at that meeting, because the meeting overall seems like I'm getting something good out of it. So I always will say to clients or people who are interested, try at least 6 meetings in a fellowship before you make a determination about whether that path is good. And as I mentioned, there's so many related fellowships now that some people would qualify for both AA and NA, for instance. And so maybe you try out both and see where you're getting your needs met the most. So those are just some tips I have for people who might want to be starting on the path.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, I go to both adult children of alcoholics as well as Codependents Anonymous, because I get great stuff out of both of them. And I think a cool thing about, I guess, both of those, for anyone watching who have those kind of issues, right, is that they totally dive into trauma for sure, right? Like, it's all about like what happened as children and the dysfunctional families and how that created various coping mechanisms that we might have adopted and that aren't working for us anymore. So yeah,